You think money can buy anything? That was the question Ethan Carter had laughed off just seconds before the room fell completely silent. The soft clink of crystal glasses and low jazz fading into nothing as every pair of eyes locked onto the scene unfolding at the center of the marble-floored restaurant, where a woman in a simple McDonald's uniform stood face to face with one of the most powerful men in the city. Aaliyah Brooks didn't belong in a place like this, not with her non-slip shoes still dusted with flour and grease. From a double shift, not under chandeliers that probably cost more than her yearly rent. And yet there she was, shoulders squared, chin lifted, her voice calm but unshakable as she said, "I'm not your joke." The words cutting through the air sharper than any insult thrown at her all night. And for the first time, Ethan Carter didn't have a comeback. 24 hours earlier, none of this had felt real. It had started as another late-night gathering of men who had too much money and not enough. Consequences, a private lounge high above Manhattan where the skyline stretched like a promise beneath floor-to-ceiling glass, where Ethan leaned back in a leather chair, cufflinks catching the dim amber light, listening as his so-called friends pushed him, laughed at him, challenged him. "You've closed billion-dollar deals, Carter, but you've never taken a real risk," one of them said, swirling a glass of bourbon. "Marry someone completely outside your world, someone who doesn't even belong in your zip code," another added, and Ethan smirked, because to him, everything was a calculation, every decision a move on a board only he understood. "Fine," he said, his voice steady, almost bored. "Name the terms." The room erupted with energy, with bets and numbers and conditions thrown like confetti, but one line stuck, one sentence that shifted everything. "A fast food waitress," someone said. "Find one, marry her. Prove you're untouchable." And Ethan didn't hesitate, because hesitation was weakness, and he had built his empire on never showing any. "Done," he replied, as if he had just signed off on another acquisition. The next morning, the city looked different to Aaliyah Brooks, not because anything had changed, but because everything was about to, though she didn't know it yet, standing behind the counter of a McDonald's off a busy avenue, the scent of fries heavy in the air, the rhythmic beep of timers blending with the morning rush. She moved quickly, efficiently, calling out orders, offering polite smiles, doing what she had always done, holding her world together one shift at a time, her hair pulled back, her uniform neat despite the long hours. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a refusal to let exhaustion or circumstance define her, even when customers barely looked at her, even when the line stretched out the door, even when her phone buzzed in her pocket with another reminder she couldn't ignore. Rent due, past due, final notice. She didn't check it right away. She couldn't afford to, not in the middle of a rush, not when every second mattered. But it sat there, heavy, like everything else she carried without complaint. Across the street, a black SUV idled longer than it should have, its windows tinted, its presence out of place in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Inside, Ethan watched. Through the glass, not with curiosity, but with intent, like he was evaluating an asset, his assistant's voice breaking the silence through the speaker. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Carter?" And he didn't answer immediately, because he was studying her, the way she handled pressure, the way she spoke to an elderly customer with patience, the way she corrected an order without making a scene. There was something there, something he hadn't expected, but expectations had never guided him. Results did set the meeting, he finally said, his tone flat, decisive, and just like that, a decision was made that would pull two completely different worlds into a collision neither of them could control. Back inside, Aaliyah finally slipped her phone out during a brief pause, her eyes scanning the message, her breath catching for just a second before she forced it steady again. She had seen worse, handled worse, survived worse, but this was the line she couldn't afford to cross, not again. Not now. She exhaled slowly, tucking the phone away, straightening her shoulders, stepping back into the rhythm of work like nothing had changed, because that was what she did. She kept going, no matter what, unaware that in less than an hour, a man who had never been told no would walk through those doors, not to order food, but to make an offer that would test everything she believed about herself, about dignity, about what it meant to be seen. And by the time the lunch rush hit, by the time the line filled the space with noise and movement and impatience, The quiet before the storm had already passed, and neither of them was ready for what came next. How much is your dignity worth? The question did not come from Aaliyah's mouth, but it hung in the air the moment the glass doors swung open and Ethan Carter stepped inside the restaurant, his presence instantly shifting the rhythm of the room. Conversations dipping just slightly, eyes flickering toward him without people even realizing why. Because men like Ethan did not just walk into places like this, they altered them, even in silence. Aaliyah noticed him the same way she noticed everything, quickly, instinctively, but she did not stare, she did not pause. She simply kept moving, calling out orders, sliding trays across the counter, her voice steady despite the lunch rush pressing in from all sides, until he reached the front, until he stood directly across from her, close enough now that the contrast between them felt almost unreal. His tailored coat, her uniform, his polished calm, her controlled urgency, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke. "What can I get for you?" she asked finally. Professional, neutral, the same tone she used with every customer, but Ethan did not answer the question, not right away, because this was not why he had come. He studied her again, up close now, the way her eyes did not drop, the way she held herself without apology, and something in that steadiness irritated him more than it should have, because it did not fit the narrative he had already written in his head. "I am not here to order," he said, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the noise around them. And that was the moment Aaliyah's attention sharpened, just slightly, not curiosity, not interest, just awareness, because people who opened with sentences like that rarely brought anything simple. "Then you are holding up the line," she replied, calm, efficient, gesturing lightly to the customers waiting behind him, a small ripple of murmurs following her words, and for the first time, Ethan's expression shifted, not into anger, but into something closer to intrigue, because she had not recognized him, or if she had, she did not care, and that was new. "Step outside with me," he said, as if it were a reasonable request, as if it were already agreed upon, and Aaliyah let out a quiet breath through her nose, the kind that carried both patience and disbelief. "I am working," she answered, already turning slightly to grab the next order ticket, signaling the conversation was over. But Ethan did not move. He stayed exactly where he was, and now the line behind him was growing. Restless, voices rising, someone sighing loudly, and still, he did not step aside. "I will make it worth your time," he added, and that was the line that made her stop, not because of what it offered, but because of what it assumed. She turned back to face him fully now, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "You think everything has a price," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating it plainly, like a fact she had seen too many times before, and for a fraction of a second, Ethan had no response, because she was not wrong, but being right did not change anything, not in his world. 10 minutes, he said instead, adjusting the terms like he would in any negotiation. "That is all I need." And behind him, the pressure of the line finally broke, a manager stepping in, calling Aaliyah's name, asking what was going on, and she glanced over, then back at Ethan, measuring something silently, not him, but the situation, the interruption, the way this moment was already pulling. Attention, already disrupting the balance she worked so hard to maintain. "Clock me out for 10, she said to her manager, surprising even herself a little as the words left her mouth, because she did not usually make impulsive decisions. But something about this, about him, about the way he stood there like the world would bend around him, made her want to see exactly how far that assumption went. Outside, the city noise rushed back in full force, car horns, footsteps, the distant rumble of traffic, and for a moment, they just stood there on the sidewalk, two people from completely different realities sharing the same patch of concrete. And Ethan wasted no time. He never did. "I want you to marry me," he said, as directly as if he were discussing a business merger, no build-up, no hesitation, just the offer placed between them like a contract already signed. Aaliyah blinked once, slow, deliberate, not because she did not understand, but because she wanted to be sure she had heard exactly what she thought she had, and then she let out a small, almost incredulous laugh, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to release the tension of how absurd it sounded. "You walked into a McDonald's and decided to propose to a stranger?" she asked. tilting her head slightly, studying him now with a different kind of attention, not as a customer, but as a question she had not yet decided how to answer. It is not a proposal, Ethan clarified, already reaching into his coat, pulling out a thin folder, crisp, prepared, the edges perfectly aligned. It is an agreement, he continued, handing it to her, and Aaliyah did not take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him, then back at it again, before finally accepting it with careful fingers, opening it just enough to see the printed pages inside, the legal language, the structure, the cold precision of it all. And as her eyes moved across the first few lines, the weight of the moment shifted, not lighter, but sharper, more defined, because this was not a joke, not to him. "You are serious," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Ethan nodded once. "Completely," he replied. And now there was no humor left in her expression, no disbelief, just a stillness that settled in. The kind that came when something unexpected forced its way into a life already stretched thin. "Why me?" she asked, finally looking back up, and Ethan's answer came without hesitation, without softness, exactly as he saw it. "Because you are exactly what they would never expect," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they carried truth, but not the kind that felt good. And Aaliyah closed the folder slowly, holding it in her hands for a second longer before speaking again. "And what happens when your 10 minutes are up?" she asked, her voice steady, but something deeper shifting beneath it now, something that had not been there before, and Ethan met her gaze, completely certain, completely unwavering. "Then your life changes," he said, as if it were already decided, as if the outcome was inevitable. And for the first time since he walked in, Aaliyah did not respond immediately, because the question was no longer whether this was real, it was whether she was willing to step into something that could change everything. And standing there on that sidewalk, with the city moving around them like nothing had happened, she realized that the answer might cost more than either of them expected. The folder felt heavier than paper should have, like it carried more than ink and signatures, like it carried a version of her life she had never imagined. And Aaliyah stood there on the sidewalk, the city noise fading just enough for her thoughts to come rushing in all at once, because this was not just a strange offer, this was a line, one that separated everything she knew from something she did not understand yet. She opened the folder again, slower this time, her eyes scanning past the legal language, the clauses, the carefully structured terms that read less like a marriage and more like a transaction, a timeline clearly defined, expectations outlined, boundaries drawn with precision, and at the bottom of the first page, a number that made her breath pause for half a second, not because she had never seen money before, but because she had never seen it attached to something like this, something so personal, something that was supposed to mean more than numbers. "This is not real," she said quietly, almost testing the words as she spoke them, and Ethan did not interrupt. He let her process it, because in his world, decisions like this were always about timing, about letting the other person reach the conclusion he already knew they would. And he watched her, not impatient, not nervous, just certain. "It is real," he answered finally, his voice even, "and it solves your problem." And that was the moment her eyes lifted from the page, locking onto his again, sharper. Now, because he had said it like a fact, like he already knew what she was dealing with, and that realization sent a small, controlled tension through her shoulders. "You do not know anything about my problems," she said, her tone steady but firmer now, and Ethan held her gaze without flinching. "Rent is overdue," he said, not as a question, not as a guess, just a statement. 3 notices in the last 10 days, and the landlord is not waiting anymore. And the air between them shifted instantly, because that was not something you said unless you had looked, unless you had decided before even asking that this conversation would happen. Aaliyah's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the folder, not enough to show panic, but enough to ground herself, because this was no longer just about an offer. It was about control, about someone stepping into her life without permission and rearranging the pieces as if they belonged to him. "You looked into me," she said, and this time there was no softness in it, just clarity, and Ethan did not deny it. "I evaluate every decision I make," he replied, as if that explained everything, as if that justified it, and in his world, it did, but standing there, with the sound of traffic and distant sirens and people passing by, without noticing the moment unfolding inches away. Aaliyah felt something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with money or contracts or opportunity, something that had to do with respect. "You think this is a solution?" she said slowly, closing the folder halfway. "But it is not your problem to solve." And for the first time, there was a crack in Ethan's certainty, not visible, not obvious, but there, because she was not reacting the way people usually did when presented with something like this. She was not rushing, not bargaining, not asking for more. She was pushing back, and that resistance did not fit into the equation he had built. "Everyone has a price," he said, quieter now, not as confident as before, and Aaliyah let out a small breath, not amused, not offended, just tired of hearing the same assumption dressed in different words. "No," she replied, shaking her head slightly. "Everyone has a breaking point. That is not the same thing." And the distinction hung there between them, subtle but undeniable, because it changed the entire meaning of what he was offering. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the city filling the silence with movement and noise and life continuing as if nothing unusual was happening. But for Aaliyah, everything had shifted, because now the question was not whether this was real, it was whether she was willing to let someone else define what her choices looked like. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, the vibration small but impossible to ignore, and she did not need to check it to know what it was. Another reminder, another deadline, another piece of reality pressing in on her from the side she could not escape, and she closed her eyes for just a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for her to feel the weight of it, the exhaustion of constantly choosing between bad options and worse ones. When she opened them again, she looked back at Ethan, really looked this time, not at the suit or the confidence or the assumption of control, but at the man standing in front of her, the one who believed this was simple, who believed this was just another decision to be made and executed, and she wondered, just briefly, what it would cost him if he was wrong. "What do you get out of this?" she asked, because that was the part that still did not make sense, the part that had nothing to do with her situation and everything to do with his. And Ethan hesitated for the first time, not long, but enough for it to matter, because the truth was not something he usually had to explain, not in situations like this. "It is a commitment I made," he said finally, choosing his words carefully, "and I do not walk away from commitments." And it was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either, and Aaliyah could hear that, could feel it in the space between what he said and what he left out. She looked down at the folder one more time, at the clean lines of the contract, at the life it promised to rearrange, and then back up at him, her expression unreadable now, not because she was hiding something, but because she was deciding something, something that would not just affect the next few weeks or months, but everything after that. "I am not signing anything today," she said, her voice calm, controlled, final for now, and Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected that, as if this was just another step in a process he had already mapped out. "You have until tomorrow," he replied, as if time itself could be negotiated, and as he turned to leave, stepping back toward the waiting car across the street, the folder still in her hands, Aaliyah stood there for a moment longer, watching him go, feeling the weight of the choice settle in deeper than she wanted to admit, because for the first time in a long time, the future was not just uncertain, it was offering her something she did not know how to refuse, and that uncertainty was far more dangerous than anything she had faced before. Sometimes the hardest choice is not between right and wrong, but between survival and self-respect, Aaliyah whispered to herself later that night, the words barely audible over the hum of the old refrigerator in her small apartment, a place that had never felt more fragile than it did now, as if the walls themselves were waiting for a decision she had not yet made. The folder sat on the table in front of her, untouched since she brought it home, its clean edges completely out of place among the worn surfaces and quiet evidence of a life built on stretching every dollar, every hour, every ounce of energy just to stay afloat. And yet it was there, impossible to ignore, like a door she had not asked for, but could not pretend did not exist. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment, trying to quiet the noise in her head, but it only grew louder, because every part of this situation pulled in a different direction, one voice reminding her who she was, what she believed, what she had always refused to compromise, and another voice, quieter but heavier, asking how long those beliefs could hold when everything around her was starting to collapse. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up, reading the message she had already memorized without needing to see it again. Final notice: vacate within 72 hours, and the words did not shock her anymore. They just settled into place like another weight she had been carrying for too long. Another reminder that life did not pause to consider dignity when rent was due. She set the phone down slowly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the folder as she did, and for a moment, she just sat there, caught between two versions of herself, one that had fought for every inch of independence, and one that was running out of room. To stand, across the city, in a space that looked nothing like hers, Ethan stood by a wall of glass overlooking the skyline, his reflection faint against the lights stretching out below, the city he had conquered piece by piece, decision by decision, each one calculated, controlled, predictable in its outcome. And yet tonight, there was something unfamiliar in the way he replayed the conversation from earlier. Not the words themselves, but the way she had said them, the way she had looked at him, like she saw through the structure he relied on, like she was not impressed, not intimidated, not interested in the things that usually made people pause. And that lack of reaction stayed with him longer than he expected. His assistant stepped into the room quietly, holding a tablet, waiting for instructions, but Ethan did not turn right away. He kept his gaze on the city, as if the answer might be somewhere in the endless grid of lights below. She did not agree, the assistant said, finally, breaking the silence with careful professionalism, and Ethan nodded once, already aware, already factoring that into the outcome. She will, he replied, not arrogantly, but with the same certainty he applied to every deal he had ever closed, because in his mind, the variables were clear, the pressure points defined, the timeline set, and yet, beneath that certainty, there was a small, unfamiliar question forming, one he did not voice, one he was not ready to examine. What if she does? Not. Back in her apartment, Aaliyah finally reached for the folder, pulling it closer, opening it again with slower, more deliberate movements, her eyes tracing each line not as an outsider, but as someone considering the reality of what it meant, the expectations, the boundaries, the life it outlined. And as she read, something shifted, not in the terms themselves, but in the way she saw them. Because this was not just about money, not just about solving a problem, it was about stepping into a world where she would be defined by something she did not choose, where every look, every whisper, every assumption would follow her. And the question was not whether she could handle that, it was whether she was willing to become part of it. She closed the folder again, pressing her hand flat against the cover for a second, grounding herself in the decision she had not yet made. And then she stood, moving to the small closet in the corner, pulling out the one thing she had kept from every job she had ever worked, her McDonald's uniform, neatly folded despite the long hours it had seen, the fabric worn but clean, and she held it for a moment, not as a reminder of where she was, but of who she had been through it all, someone who showed up, who worked, who endured, who did not let circumstances define her worth, and that mattered more than anything written in a contract. The next morning came faster than she expected, the light filtering through the thin curtains, the city already moving outside, and she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection steady, her expression calm, but her eyes sharper than they had been the day before, because whatever choice she made today, it would not be out of desperation alone, it would be on her terms, or not at all. When her phone rang, she did not hesitate this time. She answered on the first ring, her voice clear, controlled. "I need to see you," she said, not asking, not waiting, and on the other end, there was a brief pause before Ethan responded, "Name the place," and as she ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket, she took one last look around the apartment, the space that had held her life together for as long as it could, and then she picked up the folder, stepping out the door with a decision forming, not fully spoken yet, but close enough that she could feel it shaping everything that would come next. If I say yes, this ends my old life. But if I say no, I might lose it anyway. Aaliyah thought as she stepped into the quiet cafe she had chosen, a small place tucked between taller buildings, far from the polished spaces Ethan was used to, where the coffee smelled strong and real, where people sat alone or in pairs without pretending to be anything more than they were. And for a moment, standing just inside the door, she felt grounded again, like she was still in control of something, even if everything else was shifting beneath her. Ethan was already there. Of course he was, seated at a table near the window, posture straight, presence contained, as if he had been placed there with intention rather than simply arriving. And when he looked up, their eyes met instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just recognition of the moment they had both been waiting for. Aaliyah walked toward him without rushing, the folder held firmly in her hand, her steps steady, measured, each one carrying the weight of a decision she had not fully spoken yet, but could no longer avoid. And when she reached the table, she did not sit immediately. She placed the folder down first, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, as if creating order in something that felt anything but simple. "You chose this place," Ethan said, not as a question, but as an observation, his gaze moving briefly around the cafe before returning to her, and she nodded once, finally taking the seat across from him. "I needed somewhere that felt like mine," she replied, her voice calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something resolved, something that had taken shape overnight. A server approached, asking if they wanted anything, and Aaliyah ordered coffee without hesitation, simple, black, while Ethan declined with a small shake of his head, his focus never fully leaving her, because this was the moment that mattered, not the setting, not the surroundings, just the outcome. "You said I had until today," she began, her fingers resting lightly on the folder, not opening it yet, not offering it yet, and Ethan leaned back slightly, giving her space, but not distance. "You do," he confirmed, his tone steady, controlled, but there was a quiet intensity there now, something that had not been present before, because this was no longer theoretical. This was the point where the decision either aligned with his expectation or broke away from it. Aaliyah took a slow breath, her eyes dropping to the folder for just a second before lifting back to his. And in that brief pause, everything she had considered, every angle, every consequence, settled into place. "I read everything," she said, and he nodded once, as if that was expected, as if nothing in that document was meant to be hidden or softened. "Good," he replied. "Then you understand the terms." And she did, more than he realized, because she understood not just what was written, but what it implied, what it would mean to step into a life where nothing about her would be seen without context, without judgment, without assumption. "I understand what you think this is," she said slowly, her voice even, but there was an edge of clarity now that had not been there before. "But I need you to understand something too." And that was where the shift happened, subtle but undeniable, because this was no longer just his offer being considered. This was her setting the terms of her response. Ethan's expression did not change much, but his attention sharpened, because people did not usually negotiate like this with him, not when they were the ones being offered something. And yet here she was, steady, unshaken, forcing the balance to tilt, even if only slightly. "If I do this," she continued, her hand pressing lightly against the folder as if anchoring herself to the moment, "it is not because you chose me. It is because I am choosing this situation for myself." And the distinction landed with weight, because it removed the control he assumed he had. It reframed the entire arrangement. And for the first time, Ethan had to adjust his understanding of the dynamic in front of him. "That does not change the agreement," he said, not dismissive, but firm, holding on to the structure he relied on. And Aaliyah gave a small nod, acknowledging that, but not stepping back from her position. "No," she agreed, "but it changes how I enter it." And the difference was everything, even if it was not written anywhere. On those pages, the server returned with her coffee, setting it down between them, the steam rising slowly, curling into the air like a quiet pause in the conversation. And Aaliyah wrapped her hands around the cup, not for warmth, but for grounding, taking a small sip before continuing. "There are things in here that protect you," she said, tapping the folder lightly, "but nothing that protects me from what comes with being part of your world." And Ethan's gaze held steady, because that was true, because in his mind, the compensation, the structure, the outcome, those were the protections. But for her, the cost was not just financial. It was social, emotional, personal in ways that could not be measured on paper. "What do you want changed?" he asked, and the question came more quickly than expected, because despite everything, he recognized value when he saw it. And there was value in the way she approached this, in the way she refused to be reduced to a line item in an agreement. Aaliyah did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, because this was the moment where she defined not just the terms of the contract, but the terms of her own dignity within it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was clear, unwavering. "Respect is not negotiable," she said. Her eyes locked on his. "Not in private, not in public, not as part of some story you are trying to prove." And the words did not come with emotion. They came with certainty, the kind that could not be rewritten once spoken. Ethan studied her for a moment, longer than he usually would, because this was not part of the plan. This was not accounted for in the structure he had built, and yet, it did not feel like a complication. It felt like a variable he had not considered, one that might change more than just the outcome of this agreement. "Agreed," he said. Finally, the word simple, but carrying more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it was not just acceptance, it was acknowledgement. And as Aaliyah looked at him, really looked this time, she realized that whatever this was going to become, it was no longer just a dare, and that made the decision both clearer and far more dangerous than before. "Then we are clear," Ethan said, but this time the words did not sound like the end of a negotiation. They sounded like the beginning of something neither of them fully controlled anymore. And Aaliyah felt that shift immediately, subtle but undeniable, as if the air between them had changed density, no longer just transactional, no longer just defined by lines on paper. She reached for the folder, opening it again. But this time her movements were different, not hesitant, not cautious, but deliberate, like someone stepping into a role she had chosen rather than one forced upon her. Her eyes scanning the final page where the signature line waited, blank and expectant, and for a brief moment, everything around her seemed to quiet, the low hum of conversation in the cafe fading into the background, the clink of cups and distant footsteps becoming distant enough that the only thing left was the weight of the decision in her hand. "One more thing," she said, her voice steady, and Ethan did not interrupt. He had learned that much already, that when she spoke like this, it was not something to cut off or redirect. It was something to listen to carefully, because every word carried intention. "This does not change who I am," she continued, her gaze lifting from the page to meet his. "I do not become someone else just because your world expects it." And the statement was not defensive, it was not emotional. It was simply a boundary, clearly drawn, and Ethan nodded once, slower this time, because he understood boundaries in theory, but he was only beginning to understand what they meant when they came from someone who refused to bend. "You will have everything you need," he replied, defaulting slightly to the language he knew best, the language of provision, of resources, of control through capability. And Aaliyah gave a small shake of her head, not rejecting the offer, but correcting the framing. "That is not what I asked," she said quietly. And that was the moment Ethan paused, just for a second, because this was not about what he could give, it was about what he could not take. And that distinction mattered more than anything written in the contract. The pen lay beside the folder, simple, unremarkable, and yet it felt heavier than anything else on the table as Aaliyah picked it up, her fingers steady, her breath even, and without looking away from Ethan, she signed her name, each letter deliberate, clear, final, and as the ink settled onto the page, something shifted in a way that could not be undone, not easily, not cleanly. Because this was no longer a possibility, it was a reality. Ethan watched the movement closely, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a focus that bordered on something unfamiliar, something closer to awareness. Because he had expected the outcome, but not the way it would feel, not the way it would carry weight beyond the agreement itself. Aaliyah set the pen down carefully, sliding the folder across the table toward him, her hand lingering on it for just a second before letting go, as if acknowledging that something of hers was now part of something larger, something more complicated than either of them had fully defined. "Now we are clear," she said, echoing his earlier words. But this time they held a different meaning, not closure, but alignment, and Ethan accepted the folder without hesitation, flipping it open briefly to confirm what he already knew, that the decision had been made. that the structure he had built was now in motion, and yet, as he closed it again, there was a subtle shift in his posture, something less rigid, less controlled, as if the certainty he relied on had been adjusted, not broken, but altered. There will be arrangements, he said, returning to the practical steps, the logistics that always followed a decision like this. Legal, public, everything will be handled. And Aaliyah nodded once, not overwhelmed, not intimidated, just absorbing the information as part of what she had already chosen. I will need time, she added, her voice calm, to close things properly. And Ethan considered that for a moment before nodding, because for the first time, he was not just managing the outcome, he was accommodating it. You have 48 hours, he said, adjusting the timeline slightly, not as a command, but as a coordination, and she accepted that with a small nod, because that was enough to gather what she needed, enough to step away from the life she had known without leaving it unfinished. Outside, the city continued its constant motion, unaware of the agreement that had just been signed in a quiet corner cafe, unaware that two lives had just intersected in a way that would ripple far beyond this moment. And as they both stood, the space between them felt different now, not unfamiliar, but not entirely defined either, something in between, something still forming. Ethan reached for his coat, his movements precise as always, but there was a slight pause before he spoke again, something unplanned, something not part of the agreement. This will not be easy, he said, and the honesty in it was unexpected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, unfiltered, and Aaliyah met his gaze without hesitation. I did not expect it to be, she replied, and there was no fear in her voice, only clarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly what she had chosen and why. As they stepped out of the cafe together, the difference in their worlds was still visible in every detail, in the way people glanced at Ethan with recognition or curiosity, in the way Aaliyah walked beside him without shrinking, without adjusting herself to fit the space he occupied. And for the first time, Ethan noticed that, truly noticed it, the way she carried herself without apology, without hesitation, and something about that stayed with him as they reached the car waiting at the curb, the door already open, the next step already prepared, because for all his planning, for all his certainty, there was one thing he had not accounted for, not fully, not clearly. And as Aaliyah paused for just a second before stepping forward, her reflection briefly caught in the dark glass of the vehicle, there was a quiet realization forming, one that neither of them spoke aloud, that this agreement might change far more than either of them had intended. The world you are about to enter does not forgive mistakes, Ethan said quietly as the car door closed with a soft, controlled click, sealing Aaliyah into a space that felt entirely different from anything she had known before, the leather seat smooth beneath her hands, the air cool and carefully filtered, the city outside, now something to be observed through tinted glass rather than lived in directly, and for a moment, she did not respond, not because she was intimidated, but because she was taking it in, every detail, every contrast, every silent expectation that came with stepping into his world. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, almost silently, merging into traffic with a precision that mirrored everything about Ethan's life, controlled, efficient, intentional. And as the buildings began to shift from familiar streets to areas she rarely visited, Aaliyah sat back, her posture relaxed but alert, her gaze moving from the passing cityscape to Ethan, who sat across from her, his expression composed, but his attention sharper than before, as if he was not just escorting her into a new environment, but observing how she handled it. You do not need to adjust anything about yourself right now, he added, as if clarifying something unspoken, and Aaliyah let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement. I was not planning to, she replied, her tone even, but there was a subtle edge of independence in it, a reminder that whatever this arrangement was, it did not include becoming someone else to fit his expectations. Ethan's gaze held on her for a second longer than necessary, not challenging, not dismissive, just processing, because this was the part he had not fully accounted for, not resistance, but presence, the kind that did not shift under pressure. The car turned into a quieter street, one lined with buildings that rose higher, cleaner, more polished, the kind of place where everything looked intentional, where even the silence felt curated, and when the vehicle finally slowed to a stop in front of a towering structure of glass and steel, Aaliyah glanced up, taking in the scale of it. The reflection of the sky stretched across its surface, the subtle movement of people entering and exiting as if they belonged to a different rhythm entirely. "Your new residence," Ethan said simply, as if the words carried no weight, as if this was just another transition. But Aaliyah felt the shift immediately, not in fear, not in awe, but in awareness, because this was no longer an abstract idea, this was where her life would begin to change in ways she could not fully predict. The door opened before she could reach for it, a uniformed attendant stepping back with a respectful nod, and Aaliyah stepped out without hesitation, her movements steady, grounded. Even as the environment around her shifted dramatically, the sound of the city softer here, the air different, the expectations unspoken but present. Inside, the lobby stretched upward in a way that made space feel almost limitless, polished. Floors reflecting soft lighting, quiet conversations echoing just enough to remind her that this place was alive, but controlled, always controlled. And as they walked toward the elevators, Aaliyah noticed the way people looked, not openly, not rudely, but with a kind of curiosity that came from recognizing Ethan and then trying to understand who she was in relation to him. "You will get used to it," Ethan said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, and Aaliyah did not look at him. Immediately, she kept her gaze forward, absorbing the environment, measuring it against herself, before finally responding. "I am not here to get used to it," she said quietly. "I am here to understand it." And that distinction, once again, shifted something in the dynamic between them, because it meant she was not adapting blindly. She was choosing how to engage, and Ethan recognized that, even if he did not fully understand it yet. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and they stepped inside. The space enclosed but expansive, mirrors reflecting their contrasting images side by side, his tailored precision, her grounded simplicity, and for a brief moment, Aaliyah caught her own reflection, not as she had seen it before, but as it appeared now, placed within a world that had not been built for her. And yet, she did not look out of place, not because she matched it, but because she did not shrink from it. The ride upward was smooth, silent, the numbers climbing steadily, each floor marking a step further away from the life she had known. And as the doors opened again, revealing a private hallway that led to a single entrance, Aaliyah felt the finality of the transition settle in, not heavy, but real, undeniably real. Ethan moved first, unlocking the door with a quiet efficiency, stepping aside just enough to allow her to enter ahead of him, not as a gesture of politeness, but as an acknowledgement that this space, from this moment forward, would belong to both of them in ways that were still being defined. Aaliyah stepped inside, her gaze moving slowly across the interior, the clean lines, the carefully chosen details, the kind of environment that spoke of control and design rather than comfort or history. And she walked further in, her steps unhurried, her presence steady, as if she was not being introduced to something new, but evaluating something that had just been placed in her path. "Everything you need is already here," Ethan said from behind her, his voice carrying the same certainty as before. But this time, Aaliyah did not respond immediately. She reached into her bag instead, pulling out something small, something simple, her McDonald's uniform, folded neatly as always, and she placed it gently on the back of a chair, not as decoration, not as defiance, but as a statement, quiet and clear, that she was not leaving herself behind. As she stepped into this new world, Ethan watched that movement closely, something in his expression shifting again, not confusion, not disapproval, but recognition, because in that single action, she had done something he had not anticipated. She had brought her world into his, not the other way around. And as the silence settled between them, filled only by the faint hum of the city far below, it became clear that this arrangement, this agreement, was no longer moving in a single direction. It was evolving into something far more unpredictable than either of them had planned. "People will not ask who you are, they will decide," Ethan said the next morning, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that felt more like warning than instruction. As Aaliyah stood in front of a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching endlessly beneath her, smaller now, quieter from this height, like something she could observe without being swallowed by it. And for a moment she said nothing, her arms loosely crossed, her reflection faint against the glass, not out of place, but not blending in either, existing exactly as she was, unadjusted, unchanged. Behind her, the apartment had already shifted overnight, subtle movements she had not witnessed, clothes arranged in the closet, shoes aligned, surfaces cleared of anything that did not match the aesthetic of the space, as if the environment itself was trying to reshape her without asking, and she noticed it immediately, not with surprise, but with a quiet awareness that this world did not wait for permission to define its standards. Then they will be wrong, she replied finally, her tone steady, not defensive, just certain, and Ethan watched her from across the room, his posture composed. But there was a slight pause before he responded, as if he was recalibrating something he had not expected to question. Being right does not stop consequences, he said, stepping closer, not imposing, but present, and Aaliyah turned slightly, meeting his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. And being silent does not stop them either, she answered, and the exchange lingered between them, not confrontational, but charged with the kind of understanding that did not need to be explained further. A soft knock broke the moment, precise and controlled, and before either of them moved, the door opened just enough for a woman in a tailored suit to step inside, her posture professional, her expression neutral but observant, the kind of presence that carried authority without raising its voice. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone respectful. Then her eyes shifted to Aaliyah, assessing, calculating, not unkind, but not welcoming either. "We are on schedule," she added, and Ethan nodded once, turning slightly toward Aaliyah. "This is Claire," he said. "She manages everything that needs to be managed." And the phrasing was deliberate, broad enough to include more than it explained. Claire stepped forward, offering a small, controlled smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, and Aaliyah returned the greeting with the same level of composure, not matching the formality, but not rejecting it either. "Good morning," she replied, her tone natural, grounded. And for a brief moment, Claire's gaze sharpened just slightly, as if noting the difference, filing it away. "We have a schedule to prepare you for this afternoon," Claire continued, turning her attention back to Ethan briefly before addressing Aaliyah again. "There will be a public announcement." And the words landed with a quiet weight, because this was the part that moved everything from private agreement to public reality, the moment where assumptions would begin to form, where narratives would be created without her consent. Aaliyah did not react immediately. She let the information settle, her eyes moving briefly to Ethan, then back to Claire. "And what exactly does prepare mean?" she asked, her voice calm but direct, and Claire did not hesitate. "Wardrobe, presentation, media positioning." She listed, each word precise, structured, as if it were part of a system that had been executed many times before, and in that moment, Aaliyah understood something clearly. She was not the first person to be shaped by this world, but she might be the first to question it out loud. "Presentation," Aaliyah repeated, not mocking, not resisting, just examining the word itself, and Claire gave a small nod. "First impressions define perception," she said, as if it were an unchangeable truth, and Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, considering that. "Or they reveal it," she replied, and the subtle shift in meaning did not go unnoticed. Ethan watched the exchange carefully, not intervening, not redirecting, because this was a dynamic he needed to understand, not control. And as Claire gestured toward the hallway, indicating the next step, Aaliyah moved without hesitation, following her nod as someone being led, but as someone choosing to walk forward. The wardrobe room was expansive, filled with carefully selected pieces that spoke of status, precision, and expectation, fabrics that carried weight without effort, colors chosen to communicate more than style. And Aaliyah paused just inside the doorway, taking it in, not overwhelmed, not impressed, just aware of what it represented, a version of her that someone else had already imagined. "We will start here," Claire said, moving toward a section of clothing, her movements efficient, practiced, and Aaliyah stepped further in, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of one piece, then another, not selecting, just feeling, grounding herself in the reality of what was being offered. "These are not me," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but clear. And Claire turned slightly, her expression unchanged. "They will be," she replied, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who had seen transformation happen before, and Aaliyah met her gaze without hesitation. "No," she said, just as calmly. "They will be part of the situation, not who I am." And the distinction landed again, subtle but firm, drawing a line that could not be easily erased. Ethan, standing just behind them, felt something shift in that moment, not in the plan itself, but in the way it would unfold, because this was no longer about placing someone into a role. It was about watching that role be reshaped from within. "We do not have time for adjustments," Claire added, her tone still controlled, but carrying a slight edge of urgency now, because schedules did not bend easily in this world. And Aaliyah gave a small nod, acknowledging that, but not conceding her position. "Then we will not adjust who I am," she replied, her voice steady. "We will adjust how I stand in it." And the room fell quiet for just a second, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because something had just been established, something that would define everything that came next. And as Claire hesitated, just briefly, before continuing, it became clear that this was not going to be a simple transition, not for any of them. "By the time the cameras turn on, the story will already be written," Claire said as she adjusted the final detail on Aaliyah's outfit, her tone calm but precise, as if she were not just preparing a person, but finalizing a narrative that had already been decided. And Aaliyah stood still, not stiff, not uncomfortable, but aware of every movement around her, the quiet efficiency of assistants stepping in and out, the soft rustle of fabric, the subtle shift of lighting being tested just outside the room, everything moving toward a moment that would define how the world saw her. Before she even spoke a word, the outfit she wore now was not something she would have chosen, but it was something she had accepted, not as a transformation, but as a tool, a way to step into the situation without losing control of herself. And as she looked at her reflection, she did not see someone new. She saw herself standing in a different frame, one that would challenge her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Remember," Claire continued, stepping back slightly to evaluate the overall image, "you do not need to say much, just enough to reinforce the narrative." And that word again, narrative, hung in the air like something fixed, something expected, and Aaliyah's eyes shifted slightly in the mirror, her voice quiet but clear. "What narrative?" she asked, not because she did not know, but because she wanted it said out loud. Claire met her gaze in the reflection, her expression composed. "A controlled introduction," she replied. "A composed partnership, nothing more, nothing less." And Aaliyah gave a small nod, acknowledging the structure, but not fully accepting its limits, because she understood now that narratives could be shaped, but they could also be challenged, depending on who was willing to speak. Outside the room, the sound of voices grew slightly louder, the low murmur of media gathering, cameras being set, footsteps echoing through the hallway, and Ethan stood just beyond the doorway, his posture as controlled as ever, but his attention sharper than usual, because this was the point where everything moved from private arrangement to public reality. And for the first time, there was something he could not fully predict, not the reaction of the media, not the headlines, but her, the way she would step into this, the way she would hold her ground in a world that did not often allow it. "They are ready," Claire said, her voice steady as she stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the door, and Aaliyah took a slow breath, not out of fear, but out of focus, grounding herself in the moment before moving forward, because once she stepped through that door, there would be no quiet space left, no moment untouched by observation. Ethan met her as she approached, their eyes locking for a brief second, and in that glance, there was an unspoken understanding, not agreement, not alignment, but awareness that, whatever this became, it would not follow a simple path. "Stay close," he said quietly, not as a command, but as a coordination, and Aaliyah nodded once, her expression calm, her posture steady, because she was not following, she was stepping beside him. The doors opened, and the shift was immediate, the quiet control of the private space replaced by the sharp energy of cameras, lights, voices overlapping in quick succession, questions already forming before introductions were even made, and, for a moment, everything moved fast, too fast for most people to process. But Aaliyah did not rush. She stepped forward at her own pace, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, and that alone created a pause, subtle but noticeable, because she did not react the way they expected. "Mr. Carter, is it true?" One voice called out, followed by another. "Who is she?" And another, sharper, more direct. "Is this a publicity move?" And Ethan raised his hand slightly, not dramatically, just enough to signal control, and the noise shifted, not silent, but focused, waiting. "This is Aaliyah Brooks," he said, his voice clear, measured, carrying easily through the space. And for a second, all attention turned to her, not just to see, but to assess, to categorize, to define. And Aaliyah felt it, the weight of those looks, the unspoken questions behind them, the assumptions already forming, but she did not shrink from it. She did not look away. She met it directly, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. "We are married," Ethan continued, the statement landing with immediate impact, the room reacting with a surge of movement, voices rising again, questions overlapping, but Aaliyah remained steady, because she knew this moment was not about reacting. It was about defining. "Aaliyah," a reporter called out, cutting through the noise just enough. "What do you have to say about this?" And the question carried more than curiosity. It carried judgment, expectation, a test of whether she would fit into the narrative already being built around her. And for a brief second, everything slowed, not in reality, but in the way she processed it, because this was the moment where she could either confirm what they assumed or challenge it entirely. She took a small step forward, not away from Ethan, not behind him, but beside him, her voice steady when she spoke. "I am exactly who I have always been," she said, her words clear, unforced, and the simplicity of it cut through the noise more effectively than anything else could have, because it did not fit into the story they expected. It did not reinforce the assumptions they had already started to make. There was a brief pause, just long enough for the meaning to settle, for the room to adjust, and Ethan felt it too, the shift. The way the narrative he had planned was no longer fully in his control, not because it was falling apart, but because it was being reshaped in real time. The questions continued, the cameras kept flashing, the moment moved forward, but something had already changed, something subtle but undeniable, because Aaliyah Brooks had not entered the story the way they expected, and as the attention remained fixed on her, it became clear that this was no longer just about a marriage, or a dare, or a controlled narrative. It was about who would define what came next, and that answer was no longer as certain as Ethan had once believed. "You just changed the story, and they are not going to like that," Claire said under her breath the moment the press conference ended, her voice controlled but carrying a tension that had not been there before. As the doors closed behind them and the noise of cameras and overlapping questions faded into a distant echo, replaced by the quiet, structured environment of the hallway, where every step felt measured, every glance more intentional. Aaliyah did not respond immediately. She continued, walking at the same steady pace, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But inside, she could still feel the weight of that moment, the way the room had shifted when she spoke, the way expectations had cracked just slightly, and she knew that was only the beginning. Ethan walked beside her, silent at first, his usual certainty still present, but layered now with something new, something less defined. Because what had just happened was not part of the plan, not entirely, and yet, it had not failed. It had transformed. "They will spin this," Claire continued, stepping ahead slightly, already moving into problem-solving mode. "We need to control the follow-up, shape the narrative before it shapes us." And Ethan stopped walking for a moment, just long enough to create a pause in the movement around them, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but different, less rigid. "No," he said simply, and both Claire and Aaliyah turned to look at him, because that was not the response expected. "No?" Claire repeated, her tone still professional, but edged with confusion, and Ethan met her gaze directly. "We are not correcting what she said," he clarified, and the statement landed with quiet weight, because it shifted the entire strategy, not just for the media, but for everything that would follow. Claire hesitated, just briefly, because this was not how things were usually handled, not in his world, where perception was managed carefully, controlled precisely, but she nodded once. Adjusting quickly, because that was her role, to adapt, to execute. Even when the variables changed. Understood, she said, though her expression revealed she was already recalculating the next steps. Aaliyah watched the exchange without interrupting, her eyes moving between them, absorbing the shift, because this was the first time Ethan had chosen not to control the narrative completely. The first time he had allowed something to exist outside his design, and that mattered, even if he did not fully realize it yet. They reached the elevator, the doors opening with a soft chime, and as they stepped inside, the space felt quieter than before, not empty, but reflective, like a moment suspended between what had just happened and what would come next. You did not need to say that, Ethan said finally, his voice low, not critical, not approving, just acknowledging, and Aaliyah leaned back slightly against the wall, her gaze steady. I know, she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than anything else could have, because she had not spoken out of necessity, she had spoken out of choice. The elevator began to descend, the numbers shifting slowly, and Ethan's eyes moved briefly to her, studying her in a way he had not allowed himself to before, not as a decision, not as a variable, but as a person who had just stepped into his world and refused to be shaped by it. And for the first time, there was something close to respect forming, not because she fit into his expectations, but because she did not. You made it harder, he said after a moment, not accusing, just stating a fact, and Aaliyah gave a small nod, accepting that without hesitation. It was already hard, she replied, her voice calm. I just made it honest, and the distinction settled between them, quiet but undeniable, because honesty was not something his world prioritized when control was an option. The elevator doors opened again, revealing the lobby, and as they stepped out, the atmosphere had already shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way people looked, the way conversations paused just slightly, the way attention lingered a fraction longer than before, because the news had already begun to spread, the story already moving beyond the walls of the building. You should be prepared, Claire said as they walked toward the exit, her tone returning to its usual composed structure. There will be attention, questions, assumptions, and Aaliyah nodded once, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just aware, because she had already felt it, already stepped into it, and she knew it would only grow from here. Outside, the air felt different, not because the city had changed, but because she had. The way people glanced, the way phones subtly turned, the way whispers began before she even passed by. And for a brief moment, she understood exactly what Ethan had meant earlier, that the world would decide before it asked. But instead of shrinking from it, she adjusted her posture slightly, not defensively, but deliberately, standing fully in the space she occupied. The car was already waiting, the door opening as they approached, and as Aaliyah paused for just a second before stepping inside, she caught her reflection again in the dark glass, not searching for confirmation, but acknowledging the shift, the reality that this was no longer something she could step out of easily, if at all. Ethan noticed the pause, the subtle moment of stillness, and for the first time, he did not move ahead. He waited, just slightly behind her, not leading, not directing, and that small change, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, marked something deeper, something that neither of them fully understood yet. As the car door closed again and the city began to move around them, faster now, louder, more aware, it became clear that the announcement had not just introduced a story, it had started something far more unpredictable, something that could not be fully controlled. And as Aaliyah looked out at the passing streets, her expression calm but her mind steady, she realized that this was not just about surviving the world she had stepped into. It was about redefining how she would exist within it, and whether Ethan Carter was ready for that was a question that had not yet been answered. They are already digging, Claire said, her voice quieter this time, but carrying more urgency than before, as she stepped into the living room, where multiple screens were now lit with headlines, social media feeds, and live commentary, all moving faster than anyone could fully track. And Aaliyah stood near the edge of the space, her arms loosely crossed, her gaze steady as she took it all in, not reacting to each headline, not flinching at the words being thrown around, but absorbing the pattern, the way the story was forming around her without her permission, from fast food to penthouse overnight. One headline read, while another was sharper, more pointed, "Who is the woman behind Ethan Carter's sudden marriage?" And then there were the ones that did not even try to hide their tone. Calculated move or emotional mistake. And Aaliyah let out a slow breath, not because the words surprised her, but because they confirmed exactly what she had expected, that people would not ask. They would decide. Ethan stood a few feet away, watching the same screens, but his focus was not on the headlines. It was on her, on how she would respond. Because this was the part that mattered now. Not the deal, not the announcement, but the pressure that followed it, the kind that revealed what people were really made of. "We can shut this down," Claire continued, already moving toward one of the screens, her fingers hovering as if she could physically redirect the narrative, limit access, release controlled statements, restrict appearances. And Ethan did not respond immediately, because he was still watching Aaliyah, waiting to see if she would step back, if she would ask for protection, if she would choose the easier path. But she did not move. She did not turn away. She simply shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself in the space as if it belonged to her as much as it did to him. "No," Aaliyah said before Ethan could answer, her voice calm but firm, and both of them turned toward her, because that was not the expected response. Not in a situation like this, where most people would try to minimize exposure, to retreat, to regain control. "No," Claire repeated, her tone controlled but questioning, and Aaliyah nodded once, her eyes moving briefly to the screens before returning to them. "If they are going to talk, they are going to talk anyway," she said. "Hiding does not change that." And the clarity in her voice carried something stronger than resistance. It carried acceptance, not of the narrative, but of the reality that came with it. Ethan stepped closer now, his gaze steady. "And what do you think changes it?" he asked, not challenging, but genuinely asking, because this was not something he had an immediate answer for, not in the way he usually did. And Aaliyah met his gaze without hesitation. "Showing up," she replied simply, and the answer, while direct, carried layers that neither of them fully unpacked in that moment. Claire exhaled slowly, not frustrated, but recalibrating again, because this approach was not conventional, not controlled in the way she was trained to manage, but it was not reckless either. It was intentional in a different way, one that relied on presence rather than restriction. "Then we adjust the strategy," she said finally, her tone returning to its structured calm. "Visibility, but on our terms." And Ethan gave a small nod, not because he had planned it that way, but because he was beginning to understand that control did not always mean limitation. Sometimes it meant allowing something to unfold and shaping it from within. The screens continued to shift, new headlines appearing, new angles forming, and one in particular caught Aaliyah's attention, not because it was louder, but because it was quieter, more observational. She did not look intimidated. It read, and for a brief second, Aaliyah's expression softened, not into a smile, but into recognition, because that was the first thing she had seen that was not trying to define her, but to observe her. "They are watching you," Ethan said, his voice lower now, more focused, and Aaliyah nodded once. "I know," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just awareness. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after that, the initial surge of information slowing into something more manageable, and Claire stepped away to coordinate the next steps, her voice low but efficient as she spoke into her phone, while Ethan remained where he was, his attention still on Aaliyah, because this was the moment where the situation either stabilized or shifted further, and he needed to understand which direction it was going. "You are not overwhelmed," he said after a moment, not as a question, but as an observation, and Aaliyah glanced at him briefly before looking back at the screens. "I do not have time to be," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried a truth that did not need to be expanded, because overwhelm was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Ethan studied her for a second longer, something in his expression shifting again, not dramatically, but enough to mark a change, because he was beginning to see the difference between someone who adapted to pressure and someone who had been shaped by it long before he entered the picture. "This is only the beginning," he said, and this time, The words were not a warning. They were a statement of reality. And Aaliyah nodded once, her posture steady, her presence grounded. "Then we begin properly," she replied, and as the city continued to move outside, the lights shifting, the noise constant, it became clear that whatever this arrangement had started as, it was no longer confined to a dare or a contract. It was becoming something that would test both of them in ways neither had planned, and whether they would stand on the same side of that or not was a question that had not yet been answered. "This is where they decide if you belong, or if they tear you apart," Claire said quietly as the car slowed in front of a grand hotel entrance glowing under warm evening lights. The kind of place where every detail was curated to signal power, status, and unspoken rules. And Aaliyah stepped out beside Ethan. The air cooler now, sharper, filled with the low hum of arriving guests and distant music drifting from inside. And for a moment, she paused, not out of hesitation, but to take it in. Because this was not just another appearance. This was a test, one she could feel in the way people glanced before she even reached the doors. Inside, the ballroom stretched wide and luminous, chandeliers casting soft gold light across polished floors, voices blending into a controlled rhythm of conversation, laughter measured, movements precise. And as they entered together, the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Conversations dipping just slightly, eyes turning. Recognition spreading in quiet waves as Ethan Carter walked in with someone the room had already heard about, but had not yet fully seen. Aaliyah felt the attention, not as pressure, but as presence, something that moved with her as she stepped forward, her posture steady, her expression calm, and beside her, Ethan matched her pace without leading, without pulling ahead. A small change that did not go unnoticed by those who watched closely. "Stay close," he said softly, but this time it did not sound like instruction, it sounded like alignment. And Aaliyah gave a slight nod, her gaze moving across the room, not searching for approval, but observing the space she now occupied. Whispers began almost immediately, not loud, not careless, but sharp enough to carry meaning, fragments of curiosity, judgment, speculation, and she caught pieces as they passed. "That is her. She looks, I expected." And none of the sentences finished themselves fully, but they did not need to. Because the tone was clear enough, and for a brief second, the memory of her earlier life flickered, the simplicity of being unseen, of moving through spaces without this level of attention, and then it passed, replaced by the awareness that this was her reality now, and she would meet it on her terms. "Ethan," a voice called out, smooth, confident, and as they turned, a man approached, his presence polished, his smile practiced. The kind of familiarity that suggested history, and Ethan's posture shifted just slightly, not defensive, but alert. "Daniel," he replied, his tone neutral, controlled, and the exchange carried more beneath it than the words themselves revealed. Daniel's gaze moved to Aaliyah, lingering just a fraction longer than polite, assessing, measuring, and his smile adjusted, not disappearing, but sharpening. "So this is the story everyone is talking about," he said, his voice light, but the implication beneath it clear, and Aaliyah met his gaze directly, not confrontational, not withdrawn, just steady. "It is not a story," she replied calmly, and the simplicity of her response disrupted the tone he had set, just enough to shift the balance. Daniel's smile flickered for a moment, then returned, slightly tighter. "Of course," he said, though his eyes suggested he was already reconsidering his approach, and Ethan watched the exchange closely, not stepping in, not redirecting, because he understood now that intervention was not always necessary. Sometimes, presence was enough. As they moved further into the room, the interactions continued, introductions, polite conversations, subtle tests disguised as compliments, and Aaliyah navigated them with a quiet precision, not overperforming, not retreating, simply existing in each moment as herself, and that, more than anything else, unsettled the expectations around her. Because she was not fitting into the role they had prepared for her, she was redefining it in real time. "You are handling this differently than expected," Ethan said quietly as they paused near the edge of the room, his voice carrying a note of something new, something closer to curiosity than control, and Aaliyah glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged. "I am not here to meet expectations," she replied, and the words landed between them with a quiet certainty, because that had been true from the beginning. Even if it was only now becoming fully visible. Across the room, Claire observed everything, her posture composed, her attention sharp, tracking reactions, adjusting strategies in real time. But even she could see the shift, the way the narrative was not collapsing, but evolving, not controlled in the usual way, but not out of control either, something in between, something more complex. The music shifted slightly, a subtle change in rhythm, and the energy of the room followed, conversations flowing again, but with a different tone now, less dismissive, more attentive, as if the initial assumptions were being quietly reconsidered. Aaliyah moved through it all without losing herself, without adjusting her core, and Ethan noticed that, truly noticed it, the way she held her ground without force, without resistance, simply by being present, and for the first time, the idea that this arrangement could be more than what he had intended settled in with clarity he could not ignore. They are watching you differently now, he said, not as a warning, but as an observation, and Aaliyah gave a small nod, her gaze steady as she looked out across the room. Good, she replied softly, because different meant something had shifted, something had opened, and as the night continued, as conversations deepened and perceptions adjusted, it became clear that this was no longer just a test of whether she could survive his world. It was a moment where that world itself was beginning to respond to her. And whether it would accept that change or resist, it was a question that had not yet reached its answer. So tell me, Ethan, was she part of the bet, or did you just forget to tell her? Daniel's voice cut through the soft rhythm of the evening, not loud enough to draw the entire room, but sharp enough that those nearby turned their attention immediately. The kind of question that did not need amplification to land exactly where it was meant to. The air shifted, subtle but unmistakable, conversations pausing just long enough to create space around the moment, and Aaliyah felt it instantly. The weight of something she had not been told pressing into the reality she had stepped into, not as confusion, not as panic, but as clarity forming faster than she expected. Ethan's expression did not change at first, but there was a stillness in him now, something held too tightly, and that alone told her more than his words would have, because silence, in a moment like this, was never empty. It was full of everything not yet said. Daniel, Ethan said finally, his tone controlled, but lacking the ease it had carried earlier. This is not the place. And that answer, careful as it was, confirmed what Aaliyah needed to know, not in detail, not in full, but enough to understand that there was a piece of this story that had never been shared with her. She did not look at Ethan immediately. She kept her gaze forward for a second longer, letting the realization settle, not rushing to react, not allowing the room to define her response, because this was her moment to choose, not theirs. What bet? She asked then, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the tension not with force, but with precision, and the simplicity of the question made it impossible to avoid, because it did not accuse, it did not escalate, it demanded truth. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not because people were shocked, but because they were waiting, watching to see how this would unfold, whether it would confirm their assumptions or break them entirely. Ethan turned to her now, fully, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no clear structure in his expression, no immediate calculation, just a moment of hesitation that spoke louder than any explanation, and Aaliyah saw it, understood it, and in that instant, something shifted inside her, not breaking, not collapsing, but realigning. It started as a challenge, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the control it usually carried. But it is not that anymore. And the words, while honest, arrived too late to erase what had already been revealed, because beginnings mattered, not just outcomes. Aaliyah nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not because she agreed, but because she understood, and that understanding came with its own kind of clarity, the kind that did not require anger to be powerful. So I was the answer to a question you wanted to win, she said, her tone even, but the weight behind it undeniable, and Ethan stepped closer, not to close the distance, but to meet it. No, he replied, more firmly now, you are not. And for a brief second, the room held its breath, because this was no longer just a conversation, It was a turning point. Aaliyah met his gaze directly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper. Now, not wounded, not uncertain, just clear. Then prove it, she said quietly, and the challenge in her words was not dramatic, not loud, but absolute, because it was not about convincing her with explanations, it was about what he would do next. Daniel watched the exchange with interest, his earlier confidence shifting into something more cautious, because this was not unfolding the way he had intended, not collapsing into spectacle, but tightening into something more controlled, more intentional, and that made it harder to predict. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, the weight of her words settling in, and for the first time, the structure he had relied on was not enough, not the contract, not the plan, not the control, because this required something else, something he had not needed to offer before. He reached into his jacket then, not hurried, not uncertain, pulling out a folded document, familiar in shape, unmistakable in meaning, and without breaking eye contact. He placed it in her hands, the contract, the one that had started all of this, the one that defined everything between them. The room leaned in, not physically, but in attention, because this was not part of any narrative they had expected, and Aaliyah looked down at the document for just a second, her fingers tracing the edge of it, before lifting her gaze back to his. This was the agreement, Ethan said, his voice steady now, but different, stripped of calculation. And this is where it ends if that is what you choose. And the words carried something new, something unguarded, because for the first time, he was not controlling the outcome, he was offering it. Aaliyah stood there, the document in her hands, the room around her waiting, watching, but she did not look at them. She did not acknowledge the weight of their attention, she focused only on him. On the moment, on the choice in front of her, and slowly, deliberately, she folded the contract once, then again, and then she set it aside on the nearest table, not torn, not destroyed, just removed from the space between them. I did not come here for a contract, she said, her voice calm, but carrying further than before, not because it was louder, but because it was clearer. I came here for truth. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, shifting the energy in a way that could not be undone, because they did not just redefine the moment, they redefined everything that had led to it. Ethan did not look away, did not retreat, and in that stillness, something changed, something that had nothing to do with money or control or expectation, something that could not be written into an agreement or predicted in advance. And as the silence held for just a second longer, it became clear that whatever this had started as, it was no longer a game, no longer a dare, it was something real, something that would demand more from both of them than either had planned, and whether they were ready for that was a question that had only just begun to be answered.